Now, the essence of what I want you to get from this is that this model that was proposed in the 1890s is still the one in use today. There has been no subsequent research or findings that has essentially modified the model that was established by the federal government in the 1890s to explain, if not explain away, the phenomena of monumental earthwork architecture in North America. So, is safe to conclude then that the immediate predecessors of the current tribes inhabiting these regions were in fact the builders? Well, let's turn to some of what the Native Americans' own words and accounts had to say, as recorded by some of the first explorers and folks that lived with the Indians and talked to the Indians about these things. The Reverend Elias Cornelius, back in 1818, wrote an article in Silliman's American Journal of Science. He says, "I have but one more article of curiosity to mention under this division. It is one of those artificial mounds which occur so frequently in the Western country. I have seen many of them, but never of one of such dimension as that which I am now to describe. It is situated in the interior of the Cherokee Nation on the north side of the Edoe, one of the branches of the Coosa." So what is this referring to?
The Coosa.
Yeah, and this is the Etowah Mounds he's referring to here. He says, "On these great works of art, the Indians gazed with as much curiosity as any white man. I inquired of the oldest chief if the natives had any tradition respecting them, to which he answered in the negative. I then requested each to say what he supposed was their origin. Neither could tell, though all agreed in saying they were never put up by our people. It seems probable," says Reverend Elias Cornelius, "that they were erected by another race who once inhabited the country." Then René Chateaubriand, in his Voyages to America, which was actually undertaken in the 1790s, he spent lots of time with the Indian tribes, and one of the things that really riveted his attention was the monumental earthworks. He says that the Indians are in agreement in saying that their fathers came from the west, and they found the works of the Ohio just as they are to be seen today. But the date of this migration of the Indians from the west to the east varies according to the nations. Another tradition claims that the works of the Ohio were raised by the white Indians. These white Indians, according to the red Indians, were to have come from the east. And when they left the lake without shores, they came dressed like the pale faces of today. We'll skip a few things here. Squire and Davis, regarding William Bartram's manuscript on the southern Indians from his travels in North America. We'll skip down. It will be observed, however, that our authority, that is Bartram, ascribes their construction to an anterior race and assigns them a high antiquity. In his travels, which you can get reproductions of today, he remarks that the region in which they are most abundant was occupied subsequently to the arrival of the Europeans by the Cherokee, who were afterwards dispossessed by the Creeks. That, quote, "all this country was probably, many ages preceding the Cherokee invasion, inhabited by a single nation or confederacy, governed by common laws, possessing like customs, and speaking the same language, but so ancient that neither the Creeks nor the Cherokees nor the nations they conquered could render any account by whom or for what purposes these monuments were erected." Now, how many quotes like this would it take to dispel the notion that the official account or the official interpretation is deficient? We could go on. I have lots of them, and I'll just, this is from 1838. "The present wandering tribes of Indians are entirely unable to give any account of these remains or to furnish the slightest tradition respecting the ancient possessors of the soil." Because when these early explorers and settlers came upon these things, they were wonderstruck. Well, of course, they began to turn to the native inhabitants of the region to inquire as to what was the origin of these things. And consistently, to every single report, that was published from the 1700s to the end of the 1800s was the same. The current tribes that live there could furnish no information about them other than to say these were built by the ancient ones who were here before us. The Nunahai, the people who could travel anywhere, to use the term of the Cherokee. Let's see. This is talking about, let's see. Oh yeah, this is again talking about our own little complex here at the Etowah River. With its erection, the modern hunter tribe, so far as our information extends, had naught to do. Another report from 1838. I confess that I am aware of no positive evidence to show that any of the existing tribes or branches, thus distinguished by a species of armorial bearings, actually did erect monuments of earth in the shape of the animals whose names they bear. The Cherokee were the oldest existing tribes in the southeastern United States, and their empire had once existed over much of the region in which the mounds, terraces, and chunky yards were found. Yet the Cherokee admitted that they had not built these structures and denied that they had been built by the people who inhabited the country before them. These constructions, Bartram concluded, were a difficult puzzle. And so it goes. I mean, we could go on and on and on with these kinds of quotes. And it's interesting that when the excavations were done, they would frequently find skeletons within the mounds, which led the earlier researchers to conclude that they were burial mounds, okay? Typically what they would do is they would find that there were two types of skeletons. One skeleton that was near the surface, they would excavate it, and this is the ones that would get sent to the museums, that would go to the Smithsonian, that would be sent to the museums in Europe, and so forth. When they would excavate down further, they would discover that, like at the base of some of these mounds, there were skeletons who, as soon as they were exposed to light and air, crumbled to dust. Now, there were clearly two ages of skeletons, and the ones that were, upon being exposed to light and air, crumbling to dust, obviously didn't get sent to museums. The assumption was that the skeletons removed were skeletons of the builders. However, ignored in that is the obvious fact that there were two very distinct ages of skeletons. And as this, as Squire said in 1847, it is a fact well known that the modern Indians, though possessing no knowledge of the origin or objects of the mounds, were accustomed to regard them with some degree of veneration. It is also known that they sometimes buried their dead in them, in accordance with the almost invariable custom which leads them to select elevated points and the brows of hills as their cemeteries. That their remains should be found in the mounds is therefore a matter of no surprise. However, by finding these skeletons, which were almost certainly intrusive burials, it misled researchers into thinking that these were the skeletons of the builders. If these were the skeletons of modern tribes or the immediate ancestors of the modern tribes, that explains the phenomena. There's no mystery here at all, and we can dispense with such silly notions as Atlanteans or whoever. Of course, back then they didn't have a concept of people from space, I don't think. However, this is a clear fact that I find that has been essentially ignored in a lot of the modern treatments of this subject, is that there were clearly two ages of skeletons found within these mounds. Indian tradition says that these mounds were built in ancient times by a people of whom they, the Indians, know nothing and for whom they have no name. That the mounds were occupied by the Toidal Indians and subsequently by the Wyandots, but were constructed long before their time. So we could go on and on and on here. It may be suggested that the human remains found in these mounds were deposited by the existing tribes of Indians, a suggestion which derives great force from the fact that many of the Indians to this day bury in these structures, conceiving that they were originally designed for that purpose, although they possess no tradition respecting their origin. And again, he noted that the present inhabitants can give no account of the builders or the design of them. So after seeing all this, I think it's fair to question the veracity of the official account, which is basically the account that will be, if you go to any state or national park, you know, oriented towards the preservation of these, and you go in there and they'll show you their little video, their documentary, or if they have their brochure, what you will see is the official account. There will be no mention of ancient races. There's no mention of possible cross-cultural contact between New World and Old World. It's presented to the average person who reads it, who thinks, okay, it's interesting, but there's no mystery here. It's all been adequately understood and described by official scholarship.
We grew up out in the school with the trip to the Etowah. It's the Etowah burial mounds. That's how we know the name of it, the Etowah burial mounds.
Yeah, and there were burials in the mounds. I mean, yes, there were burials in the mounds. The fact that there were burials in the mounds does not imply, though, then that that was the sole function of the mounds. See, and you can see I've got a lot of these accounts. The Red Indians who occupied this country at the time of its discovery by Europeans had no knowledge nor even traditions of their predecessors. So what the white man learns from them, that is the mounds, he must learn directly from the remains of their own works. Their antiquity is as yet an entire mystery. And then we get to where he's describing many of these that were on floodplains that got eroded. And this is a line of research that's never been explored in any of the literature that I've been able to find, which would suggest or lead one to conclude that some of these things were extremely ancient, 5, 6, 7,000 years, or perhaps even some of them going back to the time of the Ice Age. But let's, the present, see every one of these, the present wandering tribes of Indians are entirely unable to give any account of these remains or to furnish the slightest tradition respecting the ancient possessors of the soil. And again, we see that every one of them has built into it a set of cosmic alignments. And this raises the question of why were they so interested in these cosmic alignments? And as my previous quote said, the invisible template on the ground that these things were laid out upon was a template determined by the cosmic alignments, by the relationship between the earth and the heavens above. Casa Rinconada in Chaco Canyon. Anybody here been to Chaco Canyon? You guys got some wonderful trips ahead of you. This was an observatory. Surrounding the rim, there are apertures, and then on the inside there are niches on the walls. So at certain key times of the year, the sun will shine through an aperture and illuminate a niche on the inside of the opposite wall. And presumably there would have been effigies or some kind of iconic figurine or something placed within the niche that would have been illuminated by the solar shaft penetrating through the aperture. Pueblo Bonita in Chaco Canyon. I have a wonderful documentary video on the astronomy of Chaco Canyon that we watch in the sacred geometry class. This is based on the same lunar alignment that we find in Newark, the northern maximum lunar, the most maximum northerly moonrise, which is the axis of the Newark earthworks, and it also determines the axis of Pueblo Bonito. So we find out here in the southwest a concern with the same principles. And then this is what we'll conclude with tonight, because this leaves a very interesting mystery. Up in a place called Big Bone Lick, up in on the Ohio-Kentucky border near Cincinnati, there's a place where back in the 1700s, when the Europeans came there, they discovered that the Indians considered a sacred ground, and when they went there, they discovered that emerging from the ground were the skeletal remains of giant mastodons. You know what a mastodon is? Similar to a woolly mammoth. It was one of the 4 species of elephants that inhabited the United States down until about 10,000 years ago. And that's part of what the second installment of what these talks are going to be about. But anyways, he's saying here, he says that this area, this marsh next to the creek, contained 30 or 40 acres in the midst of a large savanna on the east side of the river. There appeared to be the remains of 5 entire skeletons, and added that by the bones they judged the creature when alive must have been the size of a small house. Now, these were mastodons. Many remains of these mastodons have been removed from these salt licks up near the Ohio. When, back in the Revolutionary days, when Thomas Jefferson was occupying the governor's mansion in Virginia, it was not known whether these creatures existed or not. And in fact, from the jaw bones of the mastodons, it was assumed that they were carnivorous. And one of the things that Jefferson was very interested in was in recovering a living specimen. So he sent secret instructions to Lewis and Clark that were they to encounter a living mastodon in the western wilderness, if it at all possible, to capture the thing and bring it back. I think he wanted it there at the White House, because you know Thomas Jefferson had a whole room of the White House devoted to fossils. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson is considered to be one of the founders of paleontology. On being questioned if they had seen such bones in any other place, this is the Indians, they said that they had seen many such, scattered here and there in that large tract of land mentioned before, some upon the surface and some partly burned. Important clue right there. But all much more decayed by time than those they had been describing, and not any entire skeleton. I asked if they had ever heard from their old men if they or their fathers had ever seen any such large creatures living. They answered they had never heard of them other than as in the condition they are at present, or ever heard of any such creatures having been seen by the oldest man or his father, that they had indeed a tradition, such mighty creatures once frequented those savannas, and get this, that there were then men of a size proportionable to them, who used to kill them, that they had seen marks in rocks, which tradition said were made by these great and strong men, that when there were no more of these strong men left alive, God had killed these last 5 they had been questioned about, which the interpreter said was to be understood. They supposed them to have been killed by lightning. This is an example. The Indians had many traditions. Because now, as you will see, there was a beast, even on the poster that I put here, I put 2 examples of the giant beasts that inhabited North America down to about 10,000 years ago. And this included mastodons and 3 species of woolly mammoths. It included giant ground sloths that were bigger than modern-day elephants. It included camels who were 6 to 8 feet tall. It included beavers that were the size of grizzly bears. It included bears that weighed up to 2,000 pounds. There was an incredible bestiary that inhabited North America down until the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. Indians have legends about these giants that roamed, but their legends also include the idea of giant human beings. But we know there's no such thing, right? Well, if we go on, we begin to discover some interesting things. From 1877, here's a report of finding some stone hatchets, axes, and skinning stones are quite plentiful. The finest in the writer's collection was plowed up among the Kishwaukee Mounds. The Hanover Mounds have furnished this was in Illinois, the Hanover Mounds have furnished a 10-pound axe of very perfect shape. But the largest one in this section is in Dr. Everett's collection. It weighs 1 ounce over 15 pounds, is of dark color, the shape is artistic, the external boundary lines are all graceful curves, and only a giant could have wielded it. This is a 15-pound axe. A 15-pound axe, anybody who's done carpentry work and wielded a half-pound hammer will know that it takes a big, strong man to wield a half-pound hammer. What about a 15-pound axe?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, when I've talked to guys about using old weapons, you know, they basically exchange the idea of using really large weapons that are used in the movies is false because of the amount of inertia
Yeah.
that is created by those is equivalent to like using a shotgun for a lot of, as far as the mass, that it's impossible.
You mean when the heroes in the movies are depicted pulling out these big long swords? Yeah. Somebody of our stature would not wield a 15-pound axe. Now, here we got an intimation. We'll skip most of it, but we get here. This was an excavation back in the late 1800s. They got down, and we have not yet made any extended investigation of these mounds, but examined partially one group of 5. In the center of number 1, at a depth of about 5 feet, we found a human skeleton. The bones were so fragile that we could only get them out in fragments. We did not notice any very marked peculiarity as to these bones, except their great size and thickness. Now, one of the conventional views of ancient times is that people were smaller than now. And certainly that's true to a great extent. You can go to any Civil War museum, and any man in this room would probably have a difficult time putting on a uniform worn by a Civil War soldier, whose average height was 5'6" to 5'7". Okay, now here we have a mound, and there's 3 levels to it. And let's see, as we go in, the burials, there were several burials. Let's get down here. Yeah, here we go. A stone sepulcher, 2.5 feet wide, 8 feet long, 2 feet deep, was formed by placing steatite slabs, that's a type of rock, on edge at the sides and ends and others across the top. It contained the remains of a single skeleton lying on its back with the head east. The frame was heavy and about 7 feet long. Now that was found in this mound right here, and this mound here is Mound B out at Etowah. And if you go up to Etowah now, you will not find any indication whatsoever in the little videos you can watch or the literature you can get that when they excavated the mound, the only burial they found in it was a 7-foot skeleton. So, yes, and we go on. There's many accounts like this. Here's another mound being excavated. 2 human skeletons were also found in the mound, one about 7 feet long. Here's another from the historical collections of Ohio. I've gone over to into the historical collections over at Emory. You can get these old, dusty, fragile volumes out, original volumes that were published back in the 1800s. You can read this account. Among the human bones found in the mounds were some belonging to men of gigantic stature. Now get this. Some of the skulls were of sufficient capacity to admit the head of an ordinary man, and jaw bones that might have been fitted on over the face with equal facility. The other bones were proportionately large. Now, in other words, what they're saying is some of the skulls they excavated out of these mounds were big enough that it could be put completely over the head of a normal-sized man. In removing the gravel bluffs, blah, 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 hundreds of human skeletons, some of them of giant form. And how giant did they get? Well, here's one in Mississippi that was excavated. Skeleton was found right up here in that corner. It was down, it had called the Great Smith Mound. This is from the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology. And skeleton was found right in there. And let's see, at a depth of 6 feet, a small heap of bones was encountered, evidently those of a bundled skeleton. At 9 feet was an entire adult skeleton of medium size lying extended upon the left side. At the depth of 14 feet, a rather large human skeleton was found, which was in a partially upright position with the back against a hard clay wall. 19 feet from the top, the bottom of the debris was reached where, in the remains of a bark coffin, a skeleton measuring 7 1/2 feet in length and 19 inches across the shoulders was discovered. And so it goes. Huge skeletons. Here's historical collections of Ohio. Huge skeletons. In Seneca Township, in 1870, they opened an Indian mound. They found a skeleton in there at least 8 feet in height. And we could go on. There's many accounts of actually finding skeletons up to 9 feet in length buried in these mounds. let's see here. Yeah, this is, let's see. Oh yeah, and then there was another race, bodies of adults generally not more than 3 to 4.5 feet in length. So there's also evidence of finding pygmy races in North America as well as giant races. I don't have the accounts in here, but some of the accounts that I need to put in here are finding of the skeletons up to 9 feet. Then we go to ancient Sweden, and there were mounds in northern Sweden excavated back in the 1800s, and they were, some of them, up to 10 or 12 feet in height. Okay. Well, as you can see, I think from what you've seen so far, I think it would be safe to conclude that there's a lot more to this than the official accounts would acknowledge. And if I've gotten any idea across to you tonight, that's the key idea, is that it is in fact a mystery, that there are many elements to this mystery. Some of these things may be far older than the official scholarship would acknowledge, and it probably has some rather significant relevance for our own times in understanding who these people were, where they came from, what their motivations were, and ultimately what happened to them. We didn't get a chance at all to get into the medicine wheels. There's been about 4 dozen medicine wheels at least discovered in the Midwestern plains. The greatest concentration of them is in an area in the western plains of Alberta. You know, what time is it?
We got about 10 minutes on this tape.
Okay, well, we'll go, that's what we'll finish with. This shows the area in question. The Rocky Mountains are over here. Calgary is right up here. This is, if you went south of here, you would pass into Montana, right? And you'll notice there's a little arrow pointing to a glacial meltwater sluiceway right here. And here's a closer view of that sluiceway. And this sits at the center of the greatest concentration of medicine wheels in North America. And when you look at it close, we find that there is a profile, clearly Native American, which is some 2,000 feet from forehead to neck. Now, is that an artifact of nature, or is that an artificial construction that somebody put up there? Do you see it? Yeah, it's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that from the sky or?
Yeah, this you can find this on, if you go hunting with Google Earth. This is 500 feet right here. So there's 500 right here, 1,000, well, about 1,500 from the headdress to the throat, 1,500 feet.
You said that's where?
It's in western Alberta, Canada, out on the prairie. And it also happens to be in the area of the greatest concentration of medicine wheels in North America.
Do you have a name for that?
No. No, because it's not very well known.
Can you explain a medicine wheel? I'm not familiar.
A medicine wheel is a stone structure. Let's see, I may have a medicine wheel. Is a rock configuration, rock circle with lines of rock pointing to the horizon. Well, I don't know the explanation to this. Brad and I are planning a trip up to this region next summer. Anybody want to go?
Yeah.
Really? Let's take a closer look here. Yeah, this is a road. That's a road right here going up to what looks like an earring. So I'd imagine, you know, people have walked and driven over this thing for years without ever seeing it and knowing. And see, here's a beautiful example of what I'm saying about, you know, we've got this new perspective on things where we can now see things that, you know, thousands of people would have crossed this and passed over it without ever knowing it was there. Well, I highly recommend Google Earth. It's an amazing tool. And this is that's an example of the kind of things you can discover when you start spending time on Google Earth. And to end it tonight, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a perspective on what may have transpired. This is basically a map of our world as Western Hemisphere as it exists now. Here's North America. You can see Florida, the Rocky Mountains. The area where that Indian face was found is basically right up in here, just to the east of the Rocky Mountains, up along the plains. And you can see the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay. This is Greenland, the British Isles, the Mediterranean over here. Here's Cuba. So this is essentially what the world looks like now during what is known as an interglacial age. If we turn the clock back 13,000 years ago, that's what it looked like. A massive amount of ice. And somewhere between about 10,000 and 13,000 years ago, all of that ice melted away, catastrophically. And one of the purposes of these presentations is also to try to acquaint people with the nature of some of these changes that have occurred naturally prior to recorded history, because they seem to be an ongoing part of the natural processes. And this is what we're going to kind of get into if you guys want to come back in 1 week, and we would go into some of this stuff further. But just wanted to show you something here. This is a cataract formation. This exists out in Washington State. This is the remnant of a river that flowed through here at the end of the last ice age. How many of you guys have seen Niagara Falls? It's pretty impressive, isn't it? You wouldn't want to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel, would you? Neither would I. Okay, Niagara Falls is the largest recessional cataract waterfall in North America, and it's like the third or fourth largest one in the world. Okay, now this is known as Dry Falls Cataract, because this is a cataract that was formed very much like Niagara Falls was, except this is on a somewhat larger scale. And in order to appreciate how much larger, let's superimpose an image of Niagara at the same scale as this. Now, what kind of a water flow did that? There's no water flow there now. That's just a lake. But somewhere at the end of the last ice age, that was a water flow. And it wasn't the only one of that magnitude, coursing over the North American continent. Now, it's very important to understand that these kind of events have transpired on a scale that are so far outside the scale of our modern human experience that they're almost difficult to even imagine. And yet what I've tried to do is put together a program that will convey what in fact did happen. And one of the things, if you saw on the poster we did, I called this, North America, the ground zero in the last great global cataclysm. And that cataclysm is fundamental to understanding all the rest of the stuff. Why, the question that I raised earlier to start this talk was, why is there so much, using this stick analogy again, why do we go back 1 inch and recorded human history disappears? Well, if we go back 2 inches, we're here at this event, at the end of the Ice Age. And what I'm suggesting is that the events that occurred 2 inches ago have obscured everything that preceded it in the timeline. And the truth of that will only emerge once you begin to understand how awesomely powerful these events were. And the events of climate change and environmental change are currently a hot topic in political circles. If you've all seen Al Gore's documentary, he raises questions about anthropogenic, that is human-induced climate change. My only problem with all of that is essentially that in the discussions of modern climate change, what's being left out of the equation is the causes of the ancient climate change, which if you actually follow through and you come to this enough that I can actually lay out the evidence for you, you'll begin to appreciate that these ancient changes were so far beyond anything we've experienced in historical times that there literally is no comparison whatsoever. None whatsoever. And part of that, the mystery of what happened to the Mound Builders as well as other ancient cultures, is wrapped up with this mystery of what could have happened with events like this. And as with the mound builders and with the ancient cultures, there's an official explanation. There's an official explanation for this. But when you begin to probe into it beyond the surface and you look at the actual evidence, it doesn't take long to figure out that the official explanation makes no sense whatsoever. And so what I'm going to try to do here with these talks is to convey the information, show the problems with the modern explanations, and then get back into some of this kind of stuff. Ancient symbolism, because it's the ancient symbolism that can provide us with keys to deciphering a lot of these mysteries. And in fact, I could say that without the ancient symbolism and the ancient traditions and the ancient myths, it's impossible to decipher these mysteries. And so a big part of what any class that I do is about conveying this idea of the mysteries and the symbolism necessary to read the mysteries.